July 19th, 1944. Angel Island, California. The air tasted of salt and diesel. Not the warm, fish-and-blossom salt of the islands, but a sharp, industrial brine that coated the back of Fumiko's throat. She watched her own hands. The knuckles were scraped raw from the splintered planks of the transport ship. Her nails, once clean enough for a nurse's work, were rimmed with a grime she couldn't scrub away. A sharp sound, metal on metal. A truck, larger than any she had ever seen, rumbled to a stop just yards away, its engine a low growl that vibrated through the soles of her thin shoes. Dust billowed, then settled. The driver's side door swung open. A leg emerged, encased in denim trousers. Then another. A woman swung herself down from the cab. She was tall, her hair tied back in a simple kerchief, her arms bare and muscled. She moved with an economy Fumiko had only ever seen in men. The woman grabbed a wooden crate from the truck bed, hoisted it to her shoulder, and strode toward a warehouse without a second glance at the cluster of Japanese women and children huddled near the dock. Fumiko's breath caught. She felt a nudge from her friend, Heisei, a teacher from Garapan. Heisei's eyes were wide, her lips parted in a small, silent O of disbelief. They had been told they were being taken to a safe place. They had been processed, fed, and examined by male soldiers whose movements were brisk and impersonal. But this was different. This was not the act of soldier. This was work, a woman doing a man's work. The American woman's face was smudged with grease, her expression neutral, focused. She did not look oppressed. She did not look ashamed. She looked, Fumiko thought with a sudden, dizzying clarity, simply busy. The world, which had already been turned upside down by bombs and surrender, tilted again on its axis. Nothing in her 26 years, not her nursing training, not the patriotic lessons, not the quiet hierarchies of home, had prepared her for the sight of a woman heaving a crate from a truck. It was a small thing, a simple action, but it was an image of impossible strength, an anomaly that lodged itself deep behind her eyes, a question without words. The women who saw this were not soldiers. They were nurses, school teachers, mothers, and daughters, civilians swept up in the American amphibious assault on Saipan just weeks earlier. They were among the roughly 1,600 Japanese and Okinawan noncombatants, along with over 1,000 Koreans, designated as civilian internees and shipped across the Pacific. Their journey had been a blur of disorientation. From the terror of the caves and the final, desperate bonsai charges they had survived, to the bewildering processing on the island, and then the long, nauseating voyage in the belly of a transport vessel. They were now prisoners, but a peculiar kind. Not prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions, but a category of person the American system was still figuring out what to do with. Their final destination was a series of family camps scattered across the United States, places with names they couldn't pronounce like McCoy, McAllister, and Crystal City. The immediate stakes were material and stark. The American food was strange and oily, served in quantities that seemed impossibly vast after years of rationing. The clothing they were issued was coarse, functional, and utterly foreign. Wool blankets, stiff canvas shoes, shapeless cotton dresses. Everything felt temporary, provisional. But the deeper constraint was informational. They were adrift in a sea of ignorance. Their knowledge of America filtered entirely through the lens of wartime propaganda. They had been taught that America was a nation of decadent individuals, its women frivolous and weak, its society fractured. The system they were entering was, in their minds, a brittle facade. Their survival depended on correctly interpreting this new reality, a reality they were only allowed to glimpse through the narrow apertures of their confinement. The train that would carry them inland became a rolling prison, but also a classroom. Through its grimy windows, they would witness the scale of the continent, a vastness that defied imagination. Day after day, the landscape would unspool, a panorama of factories with smokestacks clawing at the sky, of endless fields of grain, of freight trains 100 cars long. And everywhere, they began to notice there were women. Women driving tractors in the fields. Women operating signals at railway crossings. Women in factory uniforms, their faces grimed with sweat, pouring out of shift changes. Each sighting was a small shock, a crack in the foundation of their understanding. They were prisoners being moved through the heart of the enemy war machine, a machine that appeared to be operated in significant part by its women. The contrast began with the hands. The Japanese women looked at their own, noticing the softness of a teacher's palm, the deftness of a nurse's fingers, the calloused pads of a mother who had ground rice and scrubbed floors. Their hands were made for the home, for the school, for the clinic, for the careful, circumscribed world of female responsibility. Then they watched the American women through the fences or from the train windows. They saw hands gripping wrenches, holding welding torches, guiding rivets into sheet metal. These hands were stained with grease and paint, their nails cut short, their knuckles often nicked and scarred. They were hands that did not serve but built. Posture was another point of comparison. A lifetime of training had taught the internees to fold themselves inward, a slight bow when speaking, a contained, modest gait, shoulders softened, gaze often lowered. It was a physical grammar of deference. The American women, they saw, stood differently. They stood with their feet apart, weight settled evenly, their shoulders back. They leaned against walls and trucks with a casualness that felt, to the Japanese women, almost confrontational. Their movements were larger, more direct, unburdened by the need to appear unassuming. The difference was audible, too. In the camps, the women from Saipan spoke in softer tones, their language built on layers of politeness and formal address. Their conversations were a careful dance of indirection. What they overheard of the American women, the female translators, the nurses, the administrative staff at the camps, was different. Their speech was louder, faster. They laughed from the belly, a sound of unself-conscious release. They used slang, they interrupted each other, they stated their needs and opinions directly, without the softening preamble the Japanese women felt was essential for social harmony. An older woman named Chio, who had run a small shop, counted the differences on her fingers at night. The way they wore trousers, as a matter of course. The way they smoked cigarettes in public. The way they drove vehicles with a bored competence. Each observation was a small, sharp stone, accumulating into a heavy weight of cognitive dissonance. This wasn't just a difference in custom. It felt like a difference in species. A young nurse, whom we will call Haney, kept a small, secret diary, writing in a shorthand she had developed for her medical notes. Her entries were not emotional outpourings, but lists of observations, as if she were diagnosing a patient. Asterisk, saw 4 women today unloading sacks from a rail car. They worked in a team. No man supervised them. Their arms showed more muscle than Sergeant Miller's. Asterisk later, she noted the camp's American stenographer, a woman named Dorothy. Asterisk, she types faster than the sound of speaking. When the lieutenant gave a confusing order, she stopped and asked him, "Do you mean X or Y, sir?" She was not afraid to question him. He answered her as an equal. Asterisk for Haney, this was a critical data point. Competence conferred a kind of authority she had never seen a woman wield with a man. An older woman, a grandmother named Kinu, focused on the absence of things. Lying on her cot at night in the barracks at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, she would listen to the unfamiliar sounds of the American Midwest. She thought about her grandchildren, her daughters. She had taught them the proper way to be patient, to endure, to find honor in quiet sacrifice for the family. She watched the female American staff interact with their children during visiting hours. There was an ease, a casual physical affection, but also an expectation of independence that felt alien. She saw a little girl, no older than 7, fall and scrape her knee. The mother, a camp administrator, cleaned the wound with a brisk efficiency. "You're tough, Sally, you'll be fine," the woman had said, giving her a quick pat before returning to her work. Kinu was stunned. There was no prolonged comforting, no drama. The expectation was resilience. Kinu found herself wondering, were American children raised without shame? Was it possible to raise a girl to be useful without teaching her to be small? These women were not specters. They were individuals whose micro-behaviors provided a constant, unsettling stream of information. Each observation forced a reevaluation of fundamental beliefs about gender, power, and national character. The internees were witnessing a society that had re-engineered the role of its women, and through their quiet, fearful, and intensely curious eyes, they were beginning to quantify the enormous gap between their world and this one. The mechanism that produced these women was invisible to the internees, yet its architecture was the most formidable weapon America possessed. It was a system of total economic and social mobilization, built on a foundation of immense industrial capacity and driven by a new, pragmatic cultural logic. The process had begun years before, but accelerated dramatically after Pearl Harbor. First came the identification of a critical resource gap. Millions of men were being drafted into the military, leaving a catastrophic labor shortage in the factories and farms that supplied the war. The solution was a deliberate, top-down campaign to redefine women's work. The government, through agencies like the War Manpower Commission and the Office of War Information, launched the largest advertising campaign in American history. It was not designed to sell a product, but to sell an idea: the patriotic duty of women to enter the industrial workforce. This was the birth of Rosie the Riveter, a fictional character who became a national icon. She was depicted as strong, competent, and feminine, working on a bomber assembly line with a riveting gun in her hands. The propaganda was relentless. Posters in post offices showed glamorous women in overalls, declaring, "We can do it." Magazines ran stories celebrating female welders and electricians. Hollywood produced films about women's vital contribution to the war effort. This cultural engineering was coupled with immense logistical and infrastructural support. The federal government, in partnership with corporations like Ford, Boeing, and Kaiser, invested billions in building new factories and converting old ones. They also funded the creation of support systems, including, in some cases, state-sponsored daycare centers, an unprecedented public investment in childcare to free women from domestic duties during their shifts. A nurse like Haney, observing the physical strength of the American women, was seeing the result of a system that had successfully framed manual labor as a form of patriotic expression. A teacher like Heisey, noticing the confidence of a female administrator, was witnessing the psychological effect of a society that had, out of necessity, granted women new levels of economic independence and public authority. The Japanese women were prisoners of a nation that had systematically unlocked the productive potential of the other half of its population. They were seeing the end result of a vast social and industrial machine, a repeatable process for turning housewives into shipbuilders, scaled across an entire continent. The contrast extended beyond the world of work and into the sphere of leisure and consumption. On the long train journey from California to Wisconsin, the train would occasionally stop in small towns for supplies. Through the windows, the internees could see glimpses of American life. They saw women driving their own cars to go shopping. This was a profound shock. In Japan, a private automobile was a luxury for the very wealthy, almost exclusively driven by men. Here, it seemed a commonplace tool, and women operated them with an unthinking ease. It implied a level of personal freedom and mobility that was difficult for the internees to comprehend. They saw money. They watched American women pay for goods in a store, pulling bills from their own wallets. They saw them in cafes, drinking coffee and smoking, laughing together, occupying public space without male chaperones. Their clothing, even in wartime, seemed abundant and varied. The internees, who had lived under strict rationing for years, were mesmerized by the simple sight of a department store window display. For them, a woman's economic life was almost entirely mediated through her husband or father. The idea of earning a significant independent wage, enough to own a car, buy fashionable clothes, and spend money on leisure, was revolutionary. This was a secondary contrast, moving from production to consumption. The first contrast showed that American women could build the machinery of war. This second one showed that they were also full participants in the economy that sustained it. In 1944, women constituted over 36% of the civilian labor force in the United States, a figure that had grown by 10 million in less than 4 years. This was the anchor data point. For the internees, it wasn't a statistic. It was a lived reality observed through the bars of a window. It was the woman with her own car, the factory worker with her own paycheck, the simple, devastating evidence of a society organized around a completely different set of assumptions about what a woman was for. The rhythm of the train's wheels on the track seemed to beat out a single, repeating question. How could their own country, which treated its women as precious but dependent domestic treasures, ever hope to compete with a nation that treated them as an industrial army? This constant stream of contradictory evidence created a profound friction, an ideological clash that took place in the quietest spaces of the women's minds. The foundational belief of their society was the concept of Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother. This was not merely a tradition. It was a nationalistic ideal promoted by the state as the cornerstone of a strong Japan. A woman's highest calling was to manage the home, raise patriotic sons, and support her husband, thereby strengthening the nation from within. Her power was domestic, her influence indirect. Everything they were now seeing violated this ideal. It presented a different model of female patriotism, one that was public, physical, and economic. One of the older women, a former ethics teacher, articulated the dissonance in a hushed conversation one evening in the barracks. "We were taught that the American woman is selfish," she whispered, her words barely audible over the snores of the sleeping women around her. "That she cares only for herself, for fashion, for parties. But the women we see are working harder than many men I know. They're building the planes that bombed our homes. Is that selfishness? Or is it a different kind of duty?" The role inversions were the most jarring. Seeing a woman direct traffic or operate a crane, or wear the uniform of a military police officer. These are not just curiosities. They were inversions of the natural order of things. It challenged their core assumptions about competence. They had been raised to believe that men possessed an innate capacity for mechanical work, for leadership, for navigating the public sphere. Women's strengths were in the realms of emotion, intuition, and nurture. But the evidence before them suggested that these capacities were not innate, but trained. What if the differences they had always taken for granted were not a matter of biology, but of opportunity? This question was deeply unsettling. If an American woman could learn to be a welder, what was to stop a Japanese woman from doing the same? And if that were true, what did it mean for the entire social structure they had been taught to uphold? The sight of American women at work was not just an observation about a foreign culture. It was an involuntary audit of their own, and it was beginning to reveal a deep, systemic vulnerability they had never been allowed to consider. The evidence accumulated, piece by piece, forming an irrefutable case. It wasn't just anecdotal sightings. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the American industrial effort was a physical fact they could not ignore. From the train, they passed the Willow Run facility in Michigan. They didn't know its name, but they saw a factory building that stretched for more than a mile, with a parking lot that held thousands of cars. One of the internees, a young woman who had studied mathematics, tried to count the cars as they passed, her lips moving silently. She gave up after reaching 2,000. She later learned from a CAM translator that at its peak, this single factory, with a workforce that was over 40% female, produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. The numbers were like blows. 6 million American women had entered the defense industry. They weren't just sewing uniforms or packing rations. They were making the steel, assembling the engines, wiring the instrument panels. Records kept by American administrators at the camps, sometimes read aloud by translators, provided further detail. Newsreels shown for the camp staff, which the internees sometimes caught glimpses of, depicted fleets of ships sliding into the water at the Kaiser shipyard in California. The narrators boasted that production time for a Liberty ship had been reduced from over 200 days to just 42. Much of the welding, they learned, was done by women. A young Okinawan woman named Shizue, who had been a farm girl, understood this evidence in the most basic terms. She had seen how long it took to build a new fishing boat in her village. Weeks of painstaking work by all the men. The idea of building a ship the size of a mountain in a matter of weeks was not just impressive, it was supernatural. This was a power that defied the logic of the world she knew. The evidence was not abstract. It was in the recollections of the women, filtered through their own areas of expertise. Haney the nurse saw a system that could mass-produce not just machines, but competent female technicians. Kinu the grandmother saw a system that could repurpose the labor of its women without societal collapse. Shizue, the farm girl, saw a system that could generate productive force on a scale that felt like a force of nature. The full weight of this realization did not land like a sudden epiphany. It arrived as a slow, creeping pressure, a physical and psychological cost paid out over sleepless nights and anxious days. The initial shock and curiosity curdled into a quiet, pervasive dread. This was the war happening right here inside their minds. For many of the women, the most acute feeling was a sense of profound, irrecoverable loss. Not just the loss of their homes or their family members, but the loss of a foundational certainty. Their entire worldview, the one that had given their lives meaning and structure, was proving to be a fatal miscalculation. One woman described the feeling as having the floor of her mind fall away. The physical manifestations were clear. Women who had stoically endured the horrors of the Saipan battlefield now found themselves unable to eat. They would sit before the plates of food in the mess hall, their stomachs clenched with an anxiety they couldn't name. Fights broke out over small things, a misplaced item, a perceived slight, as the collective stress sought an outlet. At night, the barracks were filled with the sound of quiet weeping. It was a grief for a world that no longer made sense. A younger woman, barely 18, began to pull out her own hair in clumps, a silent, desperate act of self-harm. Haney, the nurse, saw the signs of deep psychological distress all around her. The listlessness, the insomnia, the sudden fits of anger. She felt it in herself, a cold knot of fear that sat in her chest. She would lie awake, listening to the distant moan of a freight train, and the sound was no longer just a sound. It was the pulse of the monster that was devouring her world. It was the sound of a million women, just like her, building the weapons that would guarantee her country's defeat. In one moment of peak clarity, a whisper passed between two friends in the dark. "We are not just prisoners," one said to the other, her voice thin and tight. "We are ghosts. We are witnesses to the end of our world." The emotional crescendo was not loud. It was a vast, crushing silence, the weight of a truth too terrible to speak aloud. It was not that American women were superior. It was not that Japanese women were weak. The turn, the revelation that recontextualized everything they had seen, was simpler and far more devastating. The productive power of a nation in total war is not measured by the strength of its men, but by the elasticity of its social roles. America's true strategic advantage was not its factories, but its ability to redefine who was allowed to work in them. This was the insight that crystallized for Haney one afternoon as she watched a female mechanic methodically repairing the engine of a Jeep inside the camp. The woman's movements were precise, confident, and utterly devoid of performance. She was not trying to act like a man. She was simply a person solving a mechanical problem. Haney realized that the Japanese military state had demanded rigid conformity to idealized roles. Man as warrior, woman as mother. This rigidity, once seen as a source of spiritual strength, was in fact a critical structural weakness. It meant that half of the population was, by definition, excluded from the core of the industrial war effort. By contrast, American society, for all its own injustices and inequalities, had proven to be brutally pragmatic. When it needed more workers, it changed the definition of a worker. It repurposed its women, transforming a social category into an industrial one. The implications of this were immediate and chilling. It meant that Japan was not fighting a nation. It was fighting a system, a more adaptable and efficient model of human organization. It meant the war was already lost, not on the battlefield, but in the social architecture of the home front. This was not a moment of triumph for the American way of life, but a cold, forensic conclusion about the mechanics of power. The revelation was not shouted, but understood in a moment of quiet horror. The war was a mathematical equation, and Japan had voluntarily chosen to solve it using only half of its available numbers. The synthesis connects the smallest observation to the largest meaning. The initial, jarring sight of a single woman driving a truck on Angel Island was not an anomaly. It was the visible tip of a vast, submerged social and industrial iceberg. Her existence was made possible by a causal chain that began with military necessity, was forged in government policy, and was fueled by a pre-existing industrial base of incredible scale. The steps were clear. The draft created a labor vacuum. Propaganda redefined female patriotism to include industrial work. Infrastructure, from factories to daycare, was mobilized to support this new workforce. The result was the woman with grease on her face and muscle in her arms, a symbol of a society that could fundamentally re-engineer itself in a crisis. This system-scale reality had direct, human-scale consequences. It tended to produce a sense of overwhelming power in those who witnessed it from the outside. The internee's journey from shock to dawning dread was a direct response to confronting this system. The hands that they saw, capable of both building a bomber and, as they also saw, gently comforting a child, challenged their most basic categories. What this reveals is that in a total, industrialized war, a nation's cultural beliefs about gender are not a soft, secondary concern. They become a primary strategic asset or a fatal liability. A society that can flexibly redeploy its entire population has a decisive advantage over one that keeps half of its talent in reserve. The Japanese women, through no fault of their own, were the products of a system that had prized ideological purity over pragmatic efficiency. Their quiet moments in the barracks, their whispered conversations, their private diaries filled with stunned observations. These were the records of that system colliding with a more powerful, more adaptable competitor. The war, they were coming to understand, was a battle of organizational design, and they were on the wrong side of the blueprint. The air still tastes of salt and diesel. Not the salt of home, but the brine of a new, hard world. A woman stands by a fence, somewhere in the vast middle of America, and watches another woman hoist a crate onto a truck. The image no longer inspires simple shock. It is now a text she has learned to read. She sees the web of causes and effects that allowed this small moment to happen. She sees the policy, the propaganda, the economic necessity, the sheer unthinking confidence of a nation that could afford to let its women be strong in this particular way. The questions that began on that dock in California have not all been answered. They have multiplied. The unease has not vanished. It has deepened, become more specific. If your understanding of the world has been unsettled by this story, if you find yourself questioning the invisible rules that govern our own lives, then you are beginning to grasp the experience of these women. The story of what happens next, when they are forced to return to a Japan utterly broken and transformed by the very forces they witness from afar, is even more complex. To follow that journey, and to continue exploring the hidden architectures of power, subscribe to the channel and join the conversation. What is the most rigid assumption our own society holds about who is allowed to do what kind of work?